Hello, everybody, to the CUDAN Open Lab Seminar on April 18th, 2022. And today it is our greatest pleasure to have Kandler of the Max Planck Institute for Human Behavior, Ecology and Culture at Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, the other thing was in Leipzig. And you're leading the TICE lab, I can see, Theory in Cultural Evolution.
Yep.
And so basically what this is in some sense related to what we did last week, which was cultural evolution and the group from Stockholm.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the interesting things also that this is going right, we had actually a debate about this a little earlier today, that goes right into the core question about like how do we actually go from this sort of more observational research that humanists like I did my PhD in art history tend to do, to the sort of mathematical modeling, trying to understand processes, dynamics, and causality, such as evolutionary inheritance, selection. How do you do that? And so we'll talk about from patterns to process, limits to inferring processes of social learning from cultural frequency data. The stage is yours.
Thanks for the introduction. Also, thanks for the invitation. It's always fun to try to talk to such a interesting and very varied audience. And if you have questions, I would encourage you to just ask them. If we get off track, I might say like, okay, well, let's do this later. But this talk will be a little bit more on the technical side. So if there's something unclear in between, so basically just interrupt me. That might help throughout. Okay, so today's talk very generally deals with the question of how well we can infer cultural processes from frequency data taken at the population level. Now, this topic sits in a much wider set of problems, so-called pattern-to-process problems. In general, such a pattern-to-process problem, or also called inverse problem, is a process of inferring from a set of observations the underlying mechanisms that produce them by reverse engineering through mathematical or statistical models. So in the forward problem, we define a set of mechanisms through a mathematical model and analyze the output, the generated data. In the inverse problem, we look at the opposite direction. So we try to infer the set of mechanisms from the observed data. Now, a large number of scientific disciplines, such as astronomy or genetics or cultural evolution, are confronted with such inverse problems, and naturally, how well you can solve them depends partly on the quality of the available data, but also on the appropriateness of the underlying mathematical model. So on the one hand, challenges can arise when model parameters cannot be reliably estimated from the available data, or when it can be shown that different or alternative set of mechanisms can produce the same output. And this problem is, or this phenomena is called equifinality. So various underlying mechanisms can result in very similar observable outcomes. I would like to stress already at the beginning that equifinality should not be seen as a problem. It is a feature of almost any inferential analysis, but has to be taken into account, especially when analyzing the inference results. But on the other hand, problems may also occur through a misspecification of the mathematical model, meaning through omittance of important features of the cultural system, such as demographic features like age structure or changes in population size, that are able to strongly influence the observed data and in turn may lead to a false classification of a set of mechanisms as consistent or inconsistent with the data. Now, in this talk, we're going to discuss these challenges by looking at one of the main pattern-to-process problems in cultural evolution, namely the inference of process of social learning from cultural frequency data. But before we start with this, maybe just some thoughts on why this is actually an interesting topic to look at to begin with. Now, our human species has experienced an incredibly demographic success in occupying virtually every terrestrial habitat on this planet. So we basically occupy everything, almost everything, from the north going to the south. And it's widely accepted by now that the behavioral adaptation that explain the success of our species are cultural. So they are transmitted among individuals by social learning and have accumulated over generations. So social learning is defined as learning through observations of or interactions with other individuals of the populations or as products. So very broadly speaking, social learning is a means of acquiring ideas, beliefs, skills, information, in short, everything what we usually summarize as a cultural trait through other individuals, and can be seen as a cultural analog to genetic inheritance, of course, with one main difference being that social learning can happen at any point in an individual's lifetime. So far, so good, but there's no single unique way on how we learn socially. In fact, a large number of learning modes and biases have already been identified in the literature. For example, given the choice between two alternative variants of a cultural trait, individuals might have a strong preference for adopting one trait and not the other. So that's called biased social learning. And a lot of those biases do exist. And I've only chosen this scheme taken out of a review paper by Luke Randall and all to demonstrate just this huge variety that here human population, but also other non-human population exhibit in terms of the capacity for social learning. So for instance, we could have a prestige bias, meaning a preference for adopting variants from prestigious individuals, or a conformist bias, meaning a preference for high frequency variants, or a novelty bias, meaning a preference for variants that are new, only recently introduced into the system. Now, given all this variety, of ways in which we can learn socially, understanding how and when social learning is used is one of the central challenges in cultural evolution. And there's an enormous amount of theoretical and also experimental and empirical research already dedicated to these questions, where I don't have time to go into today. Instead, we're looking at a much smaller problem and ask, can we reliably infer underlying process of social learning from available cultural data? So we asked the inference question. Can we do it based on the data we have? And of course, asking the question in this way begs for the next one, namely, what is available cultural data? So in a lot of archaeological or anthropological case studies, we have population frequency detailing the usage or occurrence of different variants of a cultural trait at one or different points in time. So the structure of our inverse problem is the following. So we can observe different variants of a cultural trait, and we know their population level frequencies at one or different points in time. But what we would like to know are the underlying processes of social learning that produce those frequency patterns. And of course, this task only makes sense if social learning is indeed one of the main drivers of frequency change. And that is, of course, something that has been verified, that has to be verified for each application individually at the beginning. Okay, so that's our inverse problem. And in the following, we're really going to ask, how well can we solve this inverse problem? Because it's not a given that we actually can do. We can do this because we asked very much about very little data. The question is really, how far can we push this? And where do we have to stop? Okay, in the first part of this talk, we don't yet attempt to distinguish different social learning processes, but aim to differentiate between two big categories of learning, namely unbiased and biased social learning based on the empirical evidence. In the second part, we turn to generative inference frameworks to simultaneously test multiple hypotheses of social learning and to focus on the problem of equifinality in a little bit more detail. Okay, let's start with the first part and maybe a quick clarification what we mean by unbiased social learning. So under unbiased, or in the situation of unbiased social learning, we assume that cultural variants are chosen according to their relative frequency in the population. So they are considered neutral with respect to the success of the individual. So unbiased social learning is often called also neutral evolution. And one of the most famous models that describe this process of unbiased transmission is the so-called Wright-Fisher model. And this is a non-overlapping generations model where a new generation of cultural variants is formed by randomly sampling the replacement from the previous generation. So to illustrate this a little bit more, this is the dynamic of the Wright-Fisher model. So this is our population at time point T1. And our sorry?
We can only see slide 1 still.
Aye.
Yes.
How is this? Okay. Sorry.
No worries.
You don't see anything moving?
No.
No.
Okay. Okay, let me unshare. Oh, my screen share is paused.
Yeah.
It says no.
So maybe you can unshare, full screen it, and then share again, and that should work.
Okay, let's try this. Stop share. Apologies. It's
No worries.
the funds of giving online talks.
Great. Yes. Can we cycle through the slides so we can catch up visually?
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Quickly, this is pretty much the beginning where I just set up basically what's the issue. So in a forward problem, we usually we define a set of mechanisms, we run it forward, we solve the model, and then we basically analyze the result. The inverse problem, what we are looking at this talk today, looks really at the opposite direction. So like, okay, this is the data, and what we want to infer are the mechanisms that produced this data. So, and there's two big, at least two big issues. One is the data quality issue. So the first question is, what quality does the data need to have in order to make this inference possible? And the next one was the model specification issue. It's also like, what quality, in some sense, does the mathematical model need to have in order to make this this inference in some sense meaningful? So yeah, this is what we're going to look. We of course don't look at this process in all generality. We look at, of course, in my home field, cultural evolution, and we ask, can we infer process of social learning from cultural frequency data? So this was just the one slide with a lot of colorful pictures I'm having, just illustrating that basically our human species has successfully occupied almost every climate zone, every terrestrial habitat where they can live and where they importantly can survive. So, and the reason why we can do this is usually that the behavioral adaptation that allow us to do this are transmitted culturally. So they're transmitted via social learning and have accumulated over generation. So social learning is basically learning through observations of or interactions with other individuals of the populations or its products. And the problem here is that all sounds wonderful, but social learning is not a unique, a unique process. There are so many different ways on how we can learn socially. So, and that's basically a scheme which is taken by a review paper by Luke Randall. So this is the St. Andrews Cultural Evolution Group, where they're trying to have a classification of all these social learning biases that have been identified already to be, I think, existent here in humans. So, and this is, again, don't need to look at all of them, but this is just to hit the point home that there are just really a lot of those social learning biases. And that, of course, begs for the question of, first of all, when do we use social learning in general? And then how do we use it? So which bias is meaningful in which circumstances? And that's, of course, one of the big questions. And there is, an enormous amount of theoretical and empirical and experimental literature on this topic. And today we, take up a much smaller piece of this cake, and we only ask, can we infer processes of social learning? So this process which I have shown you in this scheme from available cultural data. So, and now our data will always be population level frequency, because that's most commonly what we can find in anthropological and archaeological case studies where these questions mainly occur. So that's the structure of our problem. So what we know are, we can observe different variants of cultural traits, basically just shown here by those different colored dots. And what we can observe are their population frequency at either one or many points in time. So, but what we now want to infer from this patterns of frequency are the underlying processes of social learning. So, and that's, again, a nice question to ask. However, whether we can do this reliably, it's on a completely different, on a different page. And that's what we want to basically figure out. What are the limits? How far can we push this inferential question based on different data qualities? That's where what we're going to do in this talk. The first part, we don't yet go into the detail and kind of trying to infer, individual social learning hypothesis, but here our task is seemingly simpler, but we will see it's complicated enough. We try to distinguish between two broad categories, unbiased and biased social learning. And the second part, I'm going to show you or introduce the so-called generative inference framework, which is able to basically simultaneously test for multiple hypotheses of social learning, but also takes the problem of equifinality explicitly into account. Okay, hopefully this is now where we have been. This is the recap of unbiased social learning. So if we assume unbiased social learning, we assume that cultural variants are chosen according to the relative frequency in the population. So everything is neutral. Basically, it's just blind copying from the population. So, and in the literature, you find much more of a neutral evolution, but in our social learning lingo, it's pretty much unbiased social learning. So, and just to show you a little bit how this works, or it is often modeled via the Wright-Fisher model, which is non-overlapping generation model, meaning that in each time point, a new generation of cultural variants or new population of cultural variants is produced. So basically, it's a good model of an annual grass, but nevertheless, it has been applied to humans very often. So what we have here is that's our population at time point t1, and we want to generate the population at time point t2, and we do this by simply random copying from the previous generation. So our variant here turns orange with a probability of roughly 3 over 11. It turns blue with roughly 6 over 11. It turns red with roughly 2 over 11. So with a very small probability, we introduce a new not seen before variant into our population. So one possibility would be that it looks like that. So this is one possibility for the population composition at the next time point. And of course, we can continue this, and that gives us a way of studying the dynamic of unbiased transmission. Okay, and now, especially or historically, and especially in archaeological application, a lot of research has focused on establishing consistency between unbiased social learning and the archaeological record. And such consistency has often been interpreted as evidence for the absence of biased social learning in the population. But we have to be very, very, very careful with those interpretations due to the already mentioned problem of equifinality. Because again, unbiased and biased social learning can produce the same population level output. And that's what's often not tested. But we will come back to this point in detail in just a little bit. Okay, so what's the general idea? What's usually applied to testing for unbiased transmission? Well, at first, we have to choose an appropriate summary statistic depending on the resolution of the available data. Then we have to generate the theoretical expectation of this statistic under unbiased social learning, which is often done based on the Wright-Fisher model at equilibrium. So, and lastly, we compare the empirical value of the statistic to the expectation to decide whether our data are consistent with the hypothesis of unbiased social learning or simply not. So, and that sounds simple enough, but our two challenges mentioned at the beginning, kind of the model misspecification and the data quality challenge, they're also present here. Because firstly, we can calculate the theoretical expectation based on a model that is not suited to describe the cultural system we are considering, but also we can have data that has not a good enough quality to make this comparison meaningful in any way. Okay, let's start off with first of this with the data misspecification problem. So again, we ask, what if the model used to generate the expectation does not include some of the important features of the cultural system considered? So more specifically, can we detect unbiased social learning by using expectations generated by a Wright-Fisher model if the cultural system generating the observed data exhibits an age structure, exhibits a social structure, allows for the learning of packages of cultural trait, or is simply not at equilibrium? So all things that very likely happen happen in well, I want to call real life, but have contributed to the to any data we can collect, but of course are not included in our Wright-Fisher model. And so all of these points, are problems my group is currently working on. For today's talk, we only look at the influence age structure can have on the dynamic of unbiased transmission. And to figure that one out, we first need to design a model that includes unbiased social learning, but also an age structure. So that's the scheme of a potential of our model. So we assume that in each time spot, an individual just ages, but it also can die with a certain probability p death. And in order to keep population size constant, we assume that in each time step, on average, n times p death individuals entering the population again. And now those naive individuals copy at random from an individual in the population that is in a specific or in a to be specified copy pool. And for this copy pool, we assume two extreme assumptions. First, we assume that our naive individual can copy randomly from all individuals of the population. And the second extreme scenario is that we can only copy from the last generation. So we can only copy from individuals of age 1. So we have generated a model where the process of social learning is still unbiased. However, now the learning process can interact with the age structure. So, and now we assume, or now in order to be kind of consistent with our archaeological case studies, which were the starting point for this consideration, we assume that we only take a sample of a specific size from our age structured population at a single point in time. So we assume an incredibly sparse data situation where we really have only one data point. So now, and this is what's done usually in this archaeological application, we analyze this sample taken from the age structured population with an expectation which is generated through a Wright-Fisher model. So on the other hand, we generate our data with an unbiased learning model that exhibits an age structure, but we analyze it with expectations that are derived for an unbiased social learning model that does not have any age structure. And then we see what that leads us to. These Wright-Fisher expectations of this test, this neutrality test, is called the Watterson's test. And just to briefly show you what's done, we know that under the Wright-Fisher model, a sample of a specific size and a number of variants follows the Un's sampling distribution. So, and that's this wonderful thing about dealing with Wright-Fisher models, because they exist these beautiful, huge mathematical machinery which you can use. So if we assume Wright-Fisher, then we know the probability for each sample that it has been produced by unbiased social learning. That's fantastic. So our test now looks as follows. We just simply generate the sum of all samples generated under unbiased social learning and sampled from our Win sampling distribution that have a probability that is smaller than the probability of our sample taken from the age-structured population. So, and if this tail probability is very small or smaller than a critical value, we just simply reject the hypothesis unbiased social. So that's the general idea. So our analysis strategy is now the following. We first run our age-structured unbiased social learning model to equilibrium, and we take a sample C0. Then we calculate this tail probability. If this tail probability is smaller than a given critical value, we reject the hypothesis, and then we record the number of times the hypothesis of unbiased social learning has been rejected. So, and that's the result if you assume that our naive individual can copy from the whole population. Nothing interesting has happened. We have the different colors are just different p-death rates, meaning we vary the steepness of the age structure. And we say, well, for all sample sizes and for all p-death values, our rejection probability is roughly 0.05, precisely our critical value. So that means that if our naive individuals can copy from the whole population, age structure has actually no effect on the cultural composition of the population under unbiased social learning. But things are completely different if you assume that our individuals can only copy from the previous generation. And now we see that especially for a higher sample sizes, the probability of rejecting the hypothesis of unbiased transmission for our age-structured sample is actually relatively high. And this phenomena gets more severe the smaller the p-des value is, so it means the steeper the age structure is. So let's take this extreme case. We have a sample size of 2000 and a p-des of 0.02. And in this case, in roughly 85% of the cases, our sample taken from an age structured but still unbiased social learning model is rejected, is considered as not being consistent with the hypothesis of unbiased social learning. So why is this? Well, if we only can copy from the previous generation, what's happening is that only this previous generation in some sense contributes to the cultural change. Everyone older than age 1 basically still hangs only around, but does not contribute to cultural change anymore because they cannot be copied. So in some sense, they still influence the cultural composition of the population because, you know, they are still there. So we still include them, but they do not affect the cultural dynamic because they can't be copied. And that's a big difference to the White-Fisher model. So, sorry, I have my slides just go very slowly. The existing, so just to sum this up, the existence of an age structure does not per se have a consequence for our ability to detect unbiased social learning. Sorry, there was a question. I did not see this.
Yes, if I may.
Yes, sure.
Actually, I'm a little bit confused about how it is possible to justify such a model where you can only learn from like people 5 years older than you, but all the other generations are existent, but you are forbidden to learn from them. That's number one. And number two, it looks like you are sort of multiplying assumptions in these things. So you get your data is relatively small as far as I understand, but you try to describe it as with more and more detailed model, which I'm at loss to understand how to possibly infer the parameters of the additional parameters of this more complicated model. Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay, cool. First question. I mean, first, what I said, I'm taking two extremes, and the one possible extreme is, you know, we copy from everyone, and the other possible extreme is we copy from a subset from it. Mm-hmm. And it is not as rare as you think. This might now go a little bit later because we have done some work on baby names, and what's interesting on the choice of a baby name, what it feels like is that the copy pool from which individual copy is not the whole population. It's actually the last 2, 3, 4 years. So, and that's precisely where it can happen. It does not need to happen. And I think this was the interesting part of this analysis, that, you know, you cannot just say, oh, this does not include age structure, so it's invalid. That's not true. The point is you have to know something more about basically how people copy, from what they copy, basically what are potential role models. And then things might go bad. So and this is basically precisely trying to understand again what do we need to include in our models and what can we safely leave out, because it actually does not affect our cultural dynamics substantially. So, and if I now know that you know, copying happens from the whole population, the cool thing is my model doesn't need to have an age structure, because I know this actually does not include the cultural dynamics substantially. So how do I know this? I don't know. This is where my anthropology collaborators need to come in and tell me, okay, this is safe to assume, that is not safe to assume. If they say like, look, we don't know anything, then it's probably interesting to basically assume, just take two extremes and say like, you know, can we do this? If this is the case, this would be the result, but if it's the case, you know, results might be invalid. So in some sense, my idea is not to say, my idea is really to figure out, does the age structure, which is not included in these standard neutral models, do we need to take it into account, or, you know, or when are those general, you know, Wright-Fisher type models, when they are still applicable? And I mean, if they're applicable, life is so much easier because we can use all this mathematical machinery. And the second point, and how far we can push it, is precisely the point where, like, what we need to figure out, because at some point we need to say, no, the data what we have is too small, and we simply cannot make any reliable inferences because the process we are having is just simply too complex. And basically what I try to understand is precisely where is the sweet spot. And I completely agree. All what I showed to you is kind of the two extreme models. And that's only to show that it is not, we should not say, okay, the model doesn't have an age structure, so it's wrong per se. It's more complex than that. And this complexity, I think, interesting to figure out, but it is actually also for our archaeologists, it is quite interesting, because there you have the problem of so-called time averaging. So if you have an archaeological record, what you often have is basically where, you know, different artifacts come to be preserved together that are deposited at different times. So, and that in some sense, it's an age structure. You know, you put things in which have been demonstrated or which have been produced at different times. Now, what the potters at that time have seen, whether they have seen all of them or whether they have just seen, you know,
there is some analogy with your baby names.
It is complicated.
From the point of view of baby names, there is an alternative mechanism of introduction.
Yeah.
People are not doing it by copying; they're doing it by following societal fashion. But people sort of living people sort of like work like fossils in a sense, yes, which sort of keep the memory of old fashions. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. That answers my question. Thank you very much.
Super. Thanks for the question. It's no, it's always good to ask, like, you know, in which scenarios make it sense, but also this is good for the rest. You know, what I want to understand is really, what do we need to include in the models and what can we leave out? Because in general, the more simpler, the better, especially for inferential purposes. But we still need to know in the situation where the simple model may provide us with misleading results. And that's basically the attempt or the purpose of this kind of analysis. Okay. So blah, 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 where are we? So if the learning process acts on the age structure by restricting the copy pool, the hypothesis of unbiased learning may be wrongly rejected. And again, there, the point Mike just made is also a good one. Is a model what we are still having actually still an unbiased transmission model? And I give him half right, that might not be, because restricting the copy pool might be also done by each person individually, so that I have another bias for just, you know, novelty. I just want to have, you know, what people of the last generation have. And I don't care what, you know, have been have happened 20 years ago. So I mean, there's really room of debate on how we can compare this. Cool. So if frequency data is only available at a single point in time, you may require additional knowledge about the age structure and the learning process to generate appropriate neutral expectation. So, and the question is, where do we get them from? Because often that's not obvious. And in an attempt to basically answer this question, or not answer, to address this question, we went away from kind of this classical let's say neutrality testing, and tried, you know, one of the new fancy methods, machine learning, but not because it's fancy, but because we were hoping it might add something. So what would we want in our situation now? We would need the probability of a sample of size n that has been generated by unbiased social learning and by a particular death rate from the population. And we need to know the specific size of the copy pool. So it's just so much. And in this situation, I'm kind of trying to write down such an elegant, beautiful formulation as, you know, when sampling distributions becomes almost intractable. So instead, what we try to do is to approximate this probability by using a machine learning approach, which reformulates the neutrality test as a binary classification problem. And I'm doing this at the moment in collaboration with Volker Kastrup, who is a kind of, well, humanities data scientist. I hope this is the right label. So supervised classification systems are trained on based on pairs of features and corresponding labels. So what do? Well, we use our age-structured social learning model, and we generate, you know, a huge sample or a huge population of samples under neutral and non-neutral conditions. So we have our two labels, neutral and non-neutral, but we also generate those samples under different p-des values and different age structures. So what we do is we create a huge pool of trainings data where we have samples where we know whether they have been generated via neutral or non-neutral conditions, and we also vary in this trainings data that basically the p-des values and the size of the copy pool where we can learn from. So now the important thing is that we need to summarize somehow this copy pool. And that means we need to calculate so-called features for each sample. And features are nothing else than basically summary statistics. So for each sample, we calculate the so-called Hill numbers. This Hill numbers is a family of diversity measures, which precisely gives us a diversity profile for each data set. So, and now we have a situation where we have a generated a training set, where we have data with the label neutral and non-neutral. And for each of these trainings data, we know the feature or the value of those features, or we know our diversity profile. So, and now we are using those machine learning techniques to learn the mapping between the features of the value of the features of the neutral category and the features of the values of the non-neutral category. So, and then we have this mapping, this function that tells you, okay, this feature, if I have this value of this feature, then it's more likely neutral, or when I have this value of this feature, then it's more likely non-neutral. Then I can apply this to my data, so to my age-structured samples, and then this mapping will give me, okay, do I classify this more as neutral, or do I classify this more as non-neutral? So, sounds cool. One caveat, of course, we have neutral and non-neutral. And non-neutral is entirely defined by the processes we use to generate the non-neutral category in our training state. So in our case, we basically have unbiased transmission, and non-neutral we use frequency-dependent social learning. So, but in order to kind of justify the label non-neutral, we would need to include much more. But you know, it comes computational at some point and feasible, and also this is more like a proof of concept study. But this is a little bit the caveat. We don't really test neutral against non-neutral. We test neutral against non-neutral as it's defined in our training set. Okay, there's this caveat. Let's go to the results. So these are the results for the rejection probability, again, for under the assumption that we can only copy from the previous generation. What we see, those rejection probabilities, they have been decreased. What is actually still remarkable to me, because again, what we have is only a tiny little bit of data. We have one sample taken from an age-structured population, and we ask of this sample a lot. I mean, we want to infer the process kind of generating it without actually having temporal data, but just one snippet, And then we also like, yeah, there could also the age structure, and you could also have a variation on the copy pool. So that we actually get something out. I was surprised, but also one has to be honest. If my age structure is just very, very steep, then, you know, we can also flip a coin and we get the same result. But again, this is not surprising because that's precisely where the limit of inference is. If I copy from only a small copy pool and I have a steep age structure, then I will not be able to make much reliable inferences based on just data on a single point in time. And I think this is the main message to learn. We can do a little bit better, especially we can get rid of the huge dependence on sample size with using this machine learning approach, but also at some point we just simply hit the limit where sophisticated mathematical machinery doesn't save us because the data just simply does not have any signature or a strong signature about the underlying process in it. So, and this is precisely in these situations the case. But just as a takeaway message, analyzing cultural data with statistics or expectation blind to important demographic features in the population may lead to erroneous inference results as cultural change caused by those features is strongly attributed to, in our case, unbiased transmission. So that's, you know, the big issue here. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question preceding that slide, so we may want to repeat this. But so these hill numbers are an interesting concept, right? So they measure diversity in the population, but they're sort of also in the vein of what you're talking about, like sort of like having a super restricted sample, and they're looking not at the full distribution. Like, am I rightly informed here, or so the key question is, if you look at the entire distributions and the whole thing in more detail, is there some caveat with this hill number there, basically?
Well, you know, in the traditional or Wynne-Watterson's test basically uses as you can reformulate it without loss of power, where the summary statistic they use is not the tail probability based on this sum of probabilities, but where they actually use the Simpson index. So basically just a heterogeneity measure. And this heterogeneity measure is kind of included in these hill numbers. So in some sense, the hill numbers of different exponents are basically, they differ in the importance they give to high frequency variance. So if we have the hill number 0, all what we get here is basically the number of variance. It's basically the richness measure. If we have 1 is, you know, unfortunately undefined, but Hill has shown that that's actually similar to, I think it's 1 over the exponential of the Shannon index. 2 is basically 1 over the heterogeneity measure, and so on. So you kind of give more importance to frequent variance while you go along. So, and the interesting part about this is that it's not just one measure. It's kind of, you know, it's kind of a diversity profile, because the beauty of these hill numbers, they can also be interpreted as it's kind of the effective number of species that would, if they would all have the same frequency, that would produce the same diversity level. So in some sense, they are all on the same unit. So it's kind of like an effective species measure. So, and they're all on the same unit. And so I can basically really have this nice, diversity profile on, yeah, you can almost see it as, it's not a continuous, but like a kind of a discrete plot where then compare it. And the beautiful, and I think where the reason why the machine learning process gets rid of this dependence on the sample size is that it gives different importance to different hill numbers and the sample size is changing.
Okay.
So and that's a cool thing, and that's, I think, the big in some sense advantage to other conventional ways of only using one summary statistic, because it figures out, okay, here the number of traits, especially for small sample sizes, the number of traits is actually not that informative. Let's look at something higher, and it just gives a high importance score to this. So and that's, happens always, this fancy machine learning mapping techniques, but this flexibility is basically really tries to get out everything possible from the data, and kind of looking at this importance of those hill numbers when the sample size are increasing is also really interesting, because we know from Wright Fisher that basically just having the number of traits or the number of variants is sufficient statistic for estimating the innovation rate and those kind of things. But here it shows that especially for small sample sizes, where you usually have, the oversampling effect, what always happens when you have small sample sizes, this with these hill numbers, which is like, let's get away with this number of traits, but look rather more on Shannon or even one with higher Qs. So, and I think that's what this kind of additional flexibility makes the machine learning approach basically a little bit invariant to sample size.
Thank you.
Cool. So I don't know what's with my computer today. It just changes slides so very slowly. Anyway, I hope I could convince you that the model specification problem is something you really need to look at for. So you really need to understand whether you need to take things into account or not. And so this basic modeling of seeing what's the effect of age structure or social structure on the dynamic of unbiased social learning, this is essential. We need to figure out what of those assumptions are crucial, because otherwise we might meet wrong inferences. And again, if my model gets too complex, then we have to be honest and say, like, look, based on this data, there's nothing we can say. We just cannot make this inference. And now we want to look a little bit on basically what quality of the data do we need to be required to make meaningful inferences. So, and here we ask, what if the available data is not complete? So, and also what I showed you before was always like, archaeological data is so notoriously bad. You might think like, it's obvious that, you have a lot of issues if you only have one sample point. But now I want to demonstrate to you that you also have issues when you have so-called big data. So what we assume now is that we have data about the cultural composition of a sample of the population at a large number of consecutive time points. So having big data is almost always a good thing. But of course, now you need to find a way of analyzing it, or you need to find a way of summarizing it. And what I show you, the summary statistic that I'm showing you now, it's incredibly crude. And I mean, of course, you can do much more with much more fancy time series methods. However, I think it illustrates the point quite nicely. And I think same kind of issues also apply to a more detailed time series analysis. So how we summarize this, a lot of data, what we have now is by using a so-called progeny distribution. This was introduced in the cultural evolution literature by Alex Stanley, and this progeny distribution records the abundance of cultural variants which produce k new individuals, progeny, over a fixed period of time. So it's usually shown on the log-log scale. So, and here, this is just simply the number of cultural variants which occur only once in my considered time frame. This is the ones that occur 100 times, 100 times, 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, and so on. So that's our progeny distribution. Now, if you want to use these distributions for our inferential purposes, what we need is, of course, the neutral expectation, or the expectation under unbiased social learning of this distribution. So, and this is work I've done together with James Latour. He's a theoretical ecologist at the University of Illinois. And again, the math is not of importance. It just needs to be there, but how it looks like, it doesn't matter. But together with him, we were able to write down the expectation under unbiased social learning for our progeny distribution. Caveat, as Wright Fisher models are notoriously difficult for generating these analytical outcomes, we kind of used a neutral birth-death process, but we confirmed with simulation that all our results are equally applicable to the Wright Fisher model. So what does it look like? So our neutral expectation actually consists of a power law phase, where we have a constant exponent 1/5, and then we have an exponential tail off. And the onset of this exponential tail off is controlled by the innovation rate. So the higher the innovation rate, the earlier is this onset of this tail off. And that's kind of a nice recognizable structure. But the other kind of nice thing of our analytical derivation is that it actually, the only unknown parameter here is this ratio d over b. So d and b are the death and the birth rates in our model. And that's fantastic because that makes the comparison between theory and empirical data relatively easy, because we could write down a maximum likelihood estimate for this ratio d over b. And that's relatively simple because k total is just the total number of progeny which have been accumulated over the considered time frame. And S is just simply the total, different or number of different variants which have been accumulated over this different time point. So, and that gives us our expectation. And we have a way also of applying our data to this expectation via this maximum likelihood estimate. But before we really look into data, maybe one point, interestingly, the shape of neutral progeny distribution is only very weakly influenced by age structure and by temporal changes in population size. So that makes, of course, a statistic kind of an interesting statistic for inferential purposes, because it's kind of not affected by usually unknown demographic features of our population. But the shape is altered when the progeny count is not taken over enough time points. So there's kind of like an equilibrium problem. And the gap between the time points where we have data is just too big. So we need some time consistency or contingency. So again, meaningful inference results based on the progeny distribution can only be obtained if the data has the right quality. So we really need a lot of data, but this data also has to be taken at almost consecutive time points. Okay, so let's look at this data quality problem from a different angle, and let me show an application we have done. We've applied our theory to an appropriate data set, which records the first name choices for girls and boys in Southern Australia. So the black line here, this is the empirical progeny distribution, and the gray line is our maximum likelihood neutral estimate. And what we see is that for both for girls and boys, our neutral theory or our unbiased social learning hypothesis is not able to generate the surprisingly large amount of low frequency names, but also not the relatively large amount of high frequency names. So in this sense, we would say like, well, unbiased transmission is not able to replicate our data pretty well. And what we have showed in the paper is some form of anti-novelty bias. So we give a slight preference to new names, replicates the data almost perfectly, what you see here in the red line.
I'm sorry, and can you just say a few words what is on the axis of this graph?
Yes, sorry. This is the number of births. Sorry, now let's get it right. This is a cumulative density plot. So we here we start at 1, and that gives me the probability of number of births. Well, means basically the probability of a child with the name Anne is smaller or equal than k. So we always start at 1. So we are at 1, and then this probability goes down, because then of course we lose all those rare ones. So that's a probability that a child has a name which has reached more than, I don't know, 1,000 individuals. So
the first name is the most popular name.
No. Here are the rare names. Mm-hmm. These are the rare. So basically, this is 1. Basically, everyone has at least one. Every name included here occurs at least 1. So the first jump to here is basically where we take out all the names which only occurred once, so all the singletons. This is the probability of a name occurs twice or more, 3 or more, 5 or more, 10 or more, thousands or more, and so on. So it's really a cumulative plot. So the reason why we have gone for cumulative is that it made just the inference a little bit easier. It's a little bit getting used to reading it. Yes, I'm now so into it, so I I tend to forget to explain it. So again, it's a cumulative plot. Here we have 1 because all names have an abundance of equal or more than 1. And we have all names that have an abundance of more or equal to 2. So we basically have subtracted all the singletons, so names that occurred only 1. And what's amazing, what I never thought is that in this time period of 50 years, 40% of names are singletons. They only occur once. And before that, I'm like, this is impossible. But that's precisely what the data says. So there is this huge amount of names, of singleton names, where a child has only been given this name once and then no other child ever again. Maybe for a reason?
I have another follow-up question for this. So we're talking about a power law with an exponential tail, but this, what you're just outlining is exactly that 40% are in this sort of like weird up curve at the beginning of the thing. There's neither the power law nor the exponential tail. And I'm sort of smiling because I have I got over peer review in Science magazine because I could explain exactly that kind of thing for the data that I had, where this was questionable location names.
Okay.
And so the peer review was violently disagreeing that this should be curved as a whole. And I said, no, actually we can, your curve, we can actually make it curve up by, in classical population size distributions, curve at the onset, there's an exponential power tail, is because small locations are integrated into sort of, Brooklyn is integrated into New York City. But if you have Moscow question mark, for example, then this curves up because you get like all these unknowns, which is actually in the humanities very, very widespread because we have all this information that we cannot sort of like neatly identify. So one of the key questions is you obviously also have this in your model. I find that really interesting. So it's not only in the data, but you also have it in the model. So how do you characterize this up curve in the model? So you mean this? Yeah, so in the slide before, you even had this, like, you were talking about, not before, this one. You were actually talking about power law and exponential cutoffs, but I already was like not suspicious, but I was like looking at this thing at the beginning. It's like, oh, this curves slightly up. This is amazing. And you put a circle around it. Yes. So where does this come from? Yes, no, but that's exactly, again, what, me and slides today. This is, I think I never appreciated it, but neutral theory, per definition, produces a huge amount of singletons, which I never thought that there is such a difference between occurring only once and occurring only or being basically copied once. And that's, it's a feature actually of neutral theory that this occurs. So, and what I show you in just a second is that the existence of this data is key for inferential power. If you don't have it, inferential power goes down, because this is where we can differentiate between things. And let's give me 2 seconds, and then we go to that, because what we're going to do now is we cut off this first rare names, and then you see that things unfortunately differ. So let's go back to our baby names. So you see also in the gray line, you see this little dip, and then it goes power law, but the dip is not deep enough. So the real baby names are even worse with number of singletons. So, and what we could do is kind of this mild anti-novelty, where we have basically, where you have it, a preference against this novel variance is able to replicate the data pretty well. So now I already said what I wanted to do now. You might ask why Southern Australia, or why showing you this at all, because that kind of looks interesting from the inferential features. We could say like, well, something else fits better, so that's good. But this is the only data set which we could find that was complete.
Many data sets, I mean, there's huge, the US baby name data sets is huge. And I think almost all countries, they have these baby name statistics, but they often only provide the most popular baby names due to privacy considerations. So mostly what they do is they either remove all names containing less than 5 instances in the whole considered time frame, or they remove all names containing less than 5 instances in each year. So one of those privacy thresholds is usually applying. So, and then we asked, like, okay, what happens if you do this to our data? Is this, reduction in quality in all the other data set? Is this interfering with our ability to say something about underlying processes? And it does. So this is again what I have shown you before. Black is always the empirical data, and gray is our maximum likelihood neutral estimate. Here we have applied the total threshold. That means we have removed all the names which have not reached a count of 5 in the considered time span, here in this case about 40 years. And all of a sudden what you see now is that, like, well, now neutral theory doesn't do such a bad job in actually describing our curve. And actually, if you see something like that, you're like, yeah, that looks neutral, and not like here, where it's like, oh no, that something might be off. But if you apply a year-by-year threshold, things are even worse, because now, neutral theory doesn't seem to match at all. So, and that's, that's an issue. So even if you have a huge amount of data, so like with the baby name statistics, this is almost one of the best modern data sets, because it is, for the most part complete, a part of those rare baby names. And if we omit those, that can lead to misleading inference results, because based on this truncated or thresholded data, of course, it looks like neutral. But of course, it also looks like, again, anti-novelty bias, what's then you often not tested for, because people say like, oh, look, it consists, or it fits the neutral patterns. So we have a huge important role for rare variants for our inferential purposes, because they seem to keep the, or this is where it seems to be the power for distinguishing, at least between, at least in our case, unbiased transmission and something of some kind of anti or pro novelty bias. Okay, so this was just to show you that it's not only about sparse data where things can go wrong. Also, when I have a lot of data, things can go wrong in ways we would not have it really anticipated before. So in all these distinction between unbiased and biased social learning is a hard problem. The specification of the neutral problem have to match the cultural system considered, and the data also has to match some requirements, mainly dictated by the used theoretical expectations. But we need to know these requirements in order to know when things, might not be as easy as they look like. Okay, but my slide would be moving. But even if we can specify an appropriate neutral model, our aim is not only to distinguish between unbiased and biased social learning, but to explore how humans learn socially. So additionally, even if we establish a consistency between unbiased social learning, we do not know in many cases whether biased social learning does indeed generate empirical patterns that deviate from neutral expectations. So these are things which I always need to take into account on top of that. So just showing, okay, it's consistent with neutrality, and that means that there's no selection happening, is just not good enough for a lot of cultural data sets, which have a very rich complexity. So what we would like to derive is a framework that allows for the inclusion of potentially complex demographic and cultural properties of the considered system, and for the simultaneous testing of a number of alternative social learning processes. And there we move to generative inference framework. Importantly, this is not an invention by us. This is actually a framework which has been incredibly successfully already applied in population genetics. And we hope that they will be, that we can use them similarly successful in cultural evolution. So it consists of two main parts. First, the generative model should be designed as ideally a non-equilibrium framework capturing the main cultural and demographic dynamics of the cultural system. But importantly, it has to produce data that are comparable to the observed data. So in our case, it should produce frequencies of different cultural variants present in the population under assumed learning hypothesis. So our generative model, on the one hand, has to establish a causal relationship between learning processes and observable frequency pattern. So it has to produce data that is comparable to the data we can observe, but it also has to generate, or we have to define the causal relationship between the mechanisms we are interested in and this data or the changes in this data. So if you have generated this, then we use some statistical comparison that can be machine learning or something else. Here I'm advocating the use of approximate Bayesian computation, which then allows for the conclusion about which mixtures of learning processes are consistent with the observable frequency data, and maybe more importantly, which are not. So again, this is something which already exists and has been very successfully applied. So it's not an invention by us, but hopefully it could be, it could help with at least some of the issues. So, and so that things get less theoretical. And sorry, I'm waiting for the slide to change. There's a holiday today in Germany. Maybe the computer is on holiday. Anyway, I want to demonstrate the application of this framework to an archaeological data system, which records the frequency of different types of decorated pottery during the Neolithic civilization. And that's work I've done with Stephen Shannon, an evolutionary anthropologist at University College London. So the data set what we're having is, for archaeological purposes, incredibly remarkable because we have time data. So the cultural trait or variance is in this thing, the pots or the different decorative motifs on those pots. And what this data set records is the frequencies of those different decorated motifs at 7 different, at the beginning and at the end of 7 different archaeological phases. So it's basically the same spatial location, but it is kind of, they could determine the time point because it is household data. So they were excavating different houses, and at that point, apparently, one generation would build the house next to the old generation. So in some sense, given the location, you could have a rough idea about, let's say, the difference or the time delay between the production of pottery that are found in those houses. So, and again, the data what we have is actually temporal, with, of course, it's good for all inferential purposes because only temporal data actually has a lot of information about underlying processes, because what we have seen, you can reach one point in many different ways. So this point is not that helpful, but when I know how we reach there, that can be much more helpful for figuring out the underlying mechanism. So the question that archaeologists had was, what are the underlying social learning processes that produce to observe changes between the beginning and the end of those different archaeological changes? And then the learning hypothesis Stephen wanted to investigate was, of course, unbiased social learning. This was more for historical reasons, because this data set has already been analyzed with different statistics, frequency biased social learnings on the form of conformity, preference for high frequency variance, and anti-conformity, preference for low frequency variance, and a novelty biased social learning. So again, fashion trend idea. So we like new things. And the question is, well, was already for the early farmers that they liked, new cups, or new pots, or new designer pots every so often. Okay. So first, we need to derive our generative model. And the first roadblock is already at the beginning, because all what we have is sample data. But any evolutionary process, of course, acts on the population level or not on the sample level. So the first step what we have to do is to go somehow from sample to population. So what we have is a sample of K cultural variants. N is the absolute abundance of those different decorative motifs or these different pots in my assemblage, and notice here a 0, which will become apparent why we have a category K plus 1 in just a second. So this is my sample, and now asking the questions: what are populations from which I could, or from which this sample could be drawn at random? So what we want is the population structure from which I can draw precisely this sample through a process of random sampling. And look, the population consists of k+1 variant, where this category k+1 contains almost everything non-observed in the sample. So that's why we kind of also try to infer the fraction of unobserved variance as kind of a lump category. So using a Dirichlet distribution approach gets us to this point. Again, the math not so much of interest. It is a distribution from which I can sample, and I can obtain this precise sample with a positive probability. So if I would do this,
and what are alphas here? What are alphas? What are alphas here? Alpha 1, alpha.
Alphas is the with this you can change. Let me see whether I have it. It's at the no, I don't have it here. Sorry. The alpha, it's called the scale of this distribution, and it gives you the importance that's given to rare variance. So this is basically if I have a category with relatively a low frequency and I have a relatively high alpha, then sampling from this rare category is given slightly more importance. Maybe I have it at the end of my slides, but my slides move so slowly, I'm hesitant to go there. I have a slide which shows you precisely how the derived relative frequencies change with changing in alpha. Maybe we can refer this question to the end of the talk, because I have a slide there. I just seems to take ages to get there. Would it be okay?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Sorry that it's moving so slowly. So anyway, we can now generate populations where these R's are relative frequencies, relative frequency of all those types observed in my sample, and a category k+1, which is a lump category with everything non-observed in my sample, but these are absolute abundances, and these are relative frequencies. But so we can go from sample to the population level via this step. We have included somehow the uncertainty, and from which I can go to sample the population, so that there's a variety or a family of populations from which this sample could have been drawn. And now we need to basically configure, or we need to run time forward and let the social learning process that I'm assuming allow to adjust or to change the population at the beginning of the phase into a population at the end of the phase. So in order to do this, we made 3 archaeologically assigned assumptions. First, we assume that sample size is a fraction of the population size. So now don't ask me why, but Stephen was very, very certain that roughly 30% of each house had been excavated. So we assume that the population size is the sample size and population size relate roughly by 0.3. So this S is not precisely 0.3, it's also a random variable, but it's centered around 0.3, which was archaeological information that was basically given into the model. Then it's also known that Pottery has only produced once a year, so they use the oven only once a year. That means we know the number of production events, basically T2 minus T1. And then we know that, and we don't know, that each year only a certain fraction of the population of cultural artifacts is removed and subsequently replaced. So basically they don't break everything in one year and then do it again. So our model is not a Wright-Fisher model, but actually we also have some age structures or time averaging, because some pots survive longer than one time step. How long they survive, this is completely unclear. So this R can be also seen basically as the average individual lifetime of a single pot, and whether a single pot now survived for 5 years, for 10 years, for 20 years. This is something archaeologists could not give a good estimate, and that's why this is a parameter which is going to be estimated from the model as well.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
So if just assuming like how this pans out, so obviously one difficulty is that the pot that you inherit from your grandfather or mother is much more probable to end up in your grave than the one of your mother, because she will give it as a gift to your daughter or your son. So that there's these kind of like timeline complications. And then the other thing is that the dating probably is also dependent on the pots, right? So there's like, there's no Olympic years for, I mean, sometimes you have a coin, but most of the time the dating is relative on the pottery. So how do you get the age structure that avoids arguments here?
The dating here had not had to be on the pots, because that would be a total mess. But as I said, it was house data. So this is all done in generation time.
Also, you have stratigraphy of the.
Because, yeah, well, I said again, this is archaeological knowledge that at that time, one house was built. You would build your next to your parents' house, and then so on. There would be this contingency of houses, and you would know. I don't know how you know which direction you have to go, but anyway, it's a different problem. And you know the occupancy is basically the difference between them is roughly kind of a generation time.
Okay.
So all of what you have mentioned is of course true, and also what we assume here with random sampling is completely wrong, because an archaeological excavation is not a random sample of what's in the soil. You usually take a certain area, and then you excavate all of what's in this area, and then you're done. So already the assumption that we generate the sample randomly from the population is more than questionable. But without the distribution of pots, without knowing the distribution of the pots in in the soil, you can come up with 107 different hypotheses, and it's complicated. So there is the question again: did we leave out too much, which is actually able to influence the change in frequency? Because now this model is incredibly simple, because all what we do is we break a couple of pots, and then we replace those couple of pots, and due to some social learning event. But inheritance, what's given over them, all of this, it's partly in it, but not explicitly. So anyway, this is then questions for later. But I think it is not a useless exercise, because I think this mathematical model has an interesting way of presenting the assumptions, and allowing them, archaeologists, to go through and say like, no, there's not, yes, this works. And in some sense, what we can say is that based on this model, we found a consistency with the data. Nobody can argue with it. But if you then found, let's say, 5, 10, or 12 models that are consistent with the data, that brings you in a really, really interesting position, because now you can argue, okay, these are models or hypotheses that I know are consistent with the data. And now archaeologists can come and say like, okay, cool. From different line of evidence, I know that this couldn't be, that this couldn't be, that this couldn't be. And I think this is where the power of mathematical modeling can come in kind of, somehow trying to produce the breadth of, hypothesis, or the breadth of models that could generate the data. And then, in concert, hopefully with empirical scientists, one can then discuss about the assumption, but then you discuss about the assumption of things that are consistent with the data. And I think, or I'm hoping that puts the discussion on a different level, as if you basically discuss about every single assumptions you have ever made without knowing whether it will make a change on the consistency of the model with the data. So, and this is where we see this is all still baby step stuff. We have to go much further than that, but my hope is that this is where math or mathematical modeling really can help, but of course only in concert with the archaeologists, or in general the empirical scientists.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so now again, what we need to do is we need to transform our population at the beginning of the phase to a population at the end of the phase. And what we just said is that only some pods break. That means some of them are carried over to the next time step. And the only thing what we have to think about is now, how do we replace all those pods that have been broken in this time steps? And here is, of course, where our social learning process come into play. And again, unbiased social learning, we know by now. Here we just simply copy according to relative frequency. If we were to assume a frequency bias social learning that comes in the flavor of conformity and anti-conformity, I only explain conformity. Anti-conformity is, I think, straightforward to understand. So conformity is a preference for high frequency variance. So, and what we do is we just simply add this selection term. If now my variant has a high frequency, then this term in the brackets is going to be positive, and therefore that this pod is, or this pottery type is chosen for reproduction is just simply increased. On the other hand, if my variant has a very low frequency, then this term in the brackets becomes negative, and the probability that this pod is chosen for reproduction is just simply decreased. And this bfrac gives me the strength of this bias. And importantly, if bfrac is just simply 0, then we recover our unbiased social learning. With the same logic, we model novelty bias. If my variant is young, so if it only has been recently introduced into the system, then this term in the brackets becomes positive, and therefore the probability that this variant has been chosen is just simply increased. And again, everywhere we have this little innovation rate, which allows for the introduction of completely new variants into the system. Okay, now we run this forward until we reach the end of our phase. And then again, to include a couple of time averaging processes, we sample from all these hypothetical populations, which are importantly generated under one specific social learning process. So we sample from all of those populations to generate a sample at the end of the phase. And this sample has the same size as the observed sample. So in some sense, what we have achieved with this framework, we have generated theoretical samples conditioned on an underlying social learning process, whether it's unbiased transmission or conformity or anti-conformity of certain strengths, or our novelty bias. This is then specified by the strengths of our selection parameters. But we have a sample of the same size as our observed sample, but we know what has produced the sample. So, and the next step, what we now have to go is we have to ask, okay, which learning processes, which are parameterized for our little r, again, where archaeologists have no idea of how long an individual pod lives, and those selection strengths are consistent with the data. So for which of those parameter values do we generate samples of the same size, which are very similar to this sample we have observed at the end of my phase. So this is now the last question we have to answer. And to do this, we use a technique, it's called Bayesian, approximate Bayesian computation. The idea of this Bayesian framework is incredibly simple, because what we do is we take our observed data, we observe our observed sample at the beginning of the phase. We draw from from some prior distribution, a value for our R and a value for our selection strengths. Then we put this into our model. We first generate our population, then we transform this population using this specific B and R parameter what we have. We sample from this population, and then we generate some theoretical sample, and then we just simply compare it to our observed sample, just using the Euclidean distance. If this Euclidean distance is small enough, then we keep this parameter set. If it's not small enough, then we just throw it away. And we do this many times, and of course in a little bit more elegant way. And what we end up are posterior distribution of the strengths of our biases. So posterior distributions for either the strengths of frequency-dependent selection or the strengths of the novelty bias, and of course, now the size or the the size of the fraction of pots that have been replaced in every year. And this posterior distribution, they give me all the parameters that have or that could have produced a sample which is very, very similar to the sample I'm having observed. And the width of this posterior distribution, this can be indicative of how much information we can actually extract from the frequency data. So take the good case first, where we have a very, very, very narrow posterior distribution. That means only a small range of our B values was able to produce our data. Which one? We don't know, but we know that a lot of them we can exclude. So that's, I think, the power here. It's not about finding the single one, it's kind of trying to exclude which has not generated the data. And if we have a wide posterior distribution, well, that's a situation where we potentially don't have much signal in the data, because almost all processes could produce data produce data similarly well to the observed data. So in this situation, either we have also screwed up with the generating or developing the generative model, or we also could say that, well, the data does not have a good enough signature about the underlying processes that we can make this inference. So the width of this posterior is quite telling about the inferential properties of our system. And just to give you some sense that could work, just a proof of concept. We assume you have a sample consisting of 7 traits or 7 variants, which have the frequency 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, 40, 60. Now you generate from this sample, populations and population forward for 50 time step, and then we generate a sample again under an anti-conformity, a unbiased transmission, and a conformist social learning. So, and then we take this data generated by our generative model, plug it in again, and ask how well can we recover the known selection strengths. So, and that's the result. Let's look at unbiased social learning first. We see, well, 0 is included in the posterior. That's good. But that also tells us that from the data we are having, basically data at the beginning and at the end of the phase, we will never be able to exclude weak or medium-sized frequency-dependent selection, because the data is not strong enough to tell us this. So it will always be unbiased or weak frequency-dependent selection. Here in this case, well, the interesting thing is we could actually exclude unbiased transmission and conformity, but how strong anti-conformity is, we have no information in the data, and similar holds for conformity. So there exist theoretical limits to the amount of information that can be extracted from sparse data. And these limits are crucial because we cannot pretend that we can, from this data, basically pinpoint this one single process that generated the data. All we can say is that, well, okay, this range of processes, at least given my underlying model, is able to generate data equally well.
I'm sorry, can you please remind, there is this bfrec over there on top, and on the axis it seems also strength B of frequency. Is it different variables here and there?
Sorry, good question. Sorry for my labeling. So basically, sorry, I'm going back. For this proof of concept, I have basically taken this one, this formulation. So, and bfrec is really the strength of this bias. If it's 0, then we have unbiased transmission. If it's negative, then we have an anti-conformity, and if it's positive, we have conformity. And what I've shown you on this slide here are those posterior distributions, and that means that the strengths, all of those strengths have generated samples, maybe with a small probability, maybe not many, but they have generated some samples which were very, very similar to the one we put in. So we have generated our sample with a selection strength of 0, so being our basically unbiased social learning. So this is what we know because we have produced it with our model. And then we have thrown this data back into our inferential machine and asked how well do we get back, you know, our known selections.
So this one is on top of is the B you use for generation, and the red one is what you recovered. I see.
Yes, exactly. So and from this you really see those posterior distributions are not super wide. So equifinality is something that we really have to take seriously, or if we do interpretations, we cannot over-interpret. Just showing the consistency with a single process doesn't mean we have found the evolutionary cause. Especially in complex scenario with little data, we have found one model which is consistent. And this is what I hope this shows. Okay, let's go back. What did our actually data look like in the end? So this is the results. It shows. Not yet. So what we could do, we could reject the hypothesis of unbiased social learning and frequency-biased social learning. This was, again, much more than I thought we would ever be doing, but we found then evidence for consistency between novelty-biased social learning and observed frequency changes. And the archaeologists were very excited about it because they were like, oh man, this is like, you know, like fashion trends. So, you know, pots were also, you know, generate, or the motif just, you know, increased and declined similar to fashion trends now. But again, think of all this transmission bias, which I have shown you at the beginning, which we have not included in the model yet. So again, all what we can say is we found evidence for consistency. So, and this is how the distribution looked like. So this on the columns here, these are different archaeological phases. So, and these are the posterior distribution for BH. Those are the strengths of our novelty selection that produced data that was very consistent with the data we could observe. So, and again, these are different archaeological phases. But in all phases, what we could see is that 0, which would indicate unbiased transmission, was not included in the posterior distribution, but also this posterior distributions were not necessarily narrow. So it was just like, yeah, you know, there's something which is not, which is biased, but you know, how strong this is, there's not much information in it. And the same you see for the fraction R of the population that has been replaced in every time step, or the mean lifetime of an individual pot. Also there, the data actually does not have much of an information, because we see that it can be almost everything from 0.2 to 0.5. So we can't estimate this parameter from the data. And that is just a plot of the joint posterior distribution. That's, you know, we were just hoping maybe there's kind of some trend line, but that there doesn't seem to be a very strong, you know, relationship between R and the selection strength. Okay, so summary 2, maybe for this part, generative inference framework may be a pretty versatile tool for interpreting population level data, particularly to assess the level of equifinality in the data. Now, I mean, this framework works with every type of data. All what it needs to be is that the generative model of whatever type it is needs to produce data that is very similar to or is comparable to the observed data, and it needs to establish this causal relationship of the process you want to infer and changes in frequency or whatever property you are interested in. It is one of the strengths of those frameworks to help us understand the limits to inferring underlying learning processes from population level data. So in some sense, the posterior distributions, that's, you know, for me, the most interesting statistic here, and kind of looking how narrow or how wide it is. And the value of those frameworks lies in that, for me at least, in the exclusion of learning process that could not have produced observed data, and therefore in a reduction of the pool of potential hypotheses. Because, you know, again, given sparse data, saying what it is would probably never be possible. But maybe, at least based on the model we have been using, we can say what's not. So, and that again is already changing the discussion base. So, and then based on sparse population level data, one should not expect to be able to infer single process, which I have now repeated many times. Okay, so let's go back to the question which I posed at the beginning. If my slide will not change. It will at some point. So far, it has done it.
It has not changed yet.
No, not for me neither. See, now it's 2 and 1. Here we go. So can we infer process of social learning from available cultural data? Well, maybe. Only in rare cases you'll be able to infer a single underlying process that could have produced the data. So the issue of equifinality is real and has to be taken into account, especially when interpreting analysis results. So often equifinality is, portrayed as a problem. It's just like, something what we need to get rid of. But it's nothing often we can get rid of, because the data often has a quality. I cannot go to archaeologists and they're like, look, I want more data. It was like, no, we don't have more. So it is for us to try to figure out how much we can tease out of this data, and also knowing when to stop. That you're like, no, more we can't, because then, we have a huge, super complex model with 75 parameters, which will perfectly match, the data, but that's basically of no inferential value anymore. So again, what's the value of all of these exercises? I think exclusion is, for me, the key point. Also, we can help inform empirical research of what kind of data to collect, if possible, to achieve a higher inferential power. That's also stuff what we do here with our anthropological colleagues, basically, who want to go out and saying, like, okay, I want to collect this data, and I would like to ask this question. What sample size do we need, or what kind of data? And that's kind of, I think, also an interesting way on how these mathematical models could, provide some guidance on. Then we could test which statistic or part of the data is most informative about the questions asked, and that facilitates the development of informative statistics as opposed to using what's already here. And I think their cultural evolution has a tendency of just borrow from, population genetics or from biology, and is only very slowly discovering its own ways of doing this, and kind of to take the cultural reality properly into account. And then understanding whether oddities of data induce a bias, inferential results, or we can do some stress testing. And then we can have a general understanding of which other processes do influence our ability to detect underlying learning processes, or maybe which are not. Maybe sometimes things surprise us. They're like, no, population structure and form of social networks actually does not make a difference. Sometimes it does, but it is important to know when it does and when it doesn't. Okay, with this, I would like to close. I want to thank quite a number of people of mine now. It started all at a very small project with Stephen, and then it blew into a, almost like a research focus of mine. I'm very sorry. I don't know why my slides are not moving. Anyway, there's a bunch of people, PhD students and postdocs involved in this process. And then I thank you for listening so patiently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was great. So applause, the typical applause. There's also the people. Let's bring them back up. So yes. Thank you very much. This is great. This was also very much at the mathematical end of what cultural data analytics does. If you look at the talks in the last 3 semesters, and I'm very happy that we're sort of like covering that aspect. And I think one of the difficulties is obviously to discuss how it is like, for everybody, for the full spectrum of like, what does it all mean? And I like your consequence and your emphasis on this exclusion of models that don't work is probably more valuable than to sort of like have a pie fight about like which one is the right model in essence. And so I think one of the cool things there is that this is something that touches all of us, right? Like if you think about the humanities having this kind of bias towards types, averages, generalizations that are intuitive, like all Ukrainians are like this or all Russians are like this or that. As opposed to we, since a couple of decades, find an increasing number of different tailed frequency distributions, which are fundamentally out of sync, which is the exclusion of this Gaussian sort of, there is, say, the type of a Gothic cathedral, which doesn't exist. There is a couple of examples and most of the churches don't fit it. And so that kind of thing is, I think, what you're showing here is basically doing that in more detail. And I think there is a sort of hand in hand that is kind of, that you also line out, where you say, I noticed that because I found the sentence very funny, where you say that's where your anthropology calibrators came in, or come in. Like in my world, we're quantifying cultural systems, and often, like if you do this long enough, it boils down to having all these weird-tailed frequency statistics. And the first 10 years of this century, people talk about, is it a power or not? But now it's like, oh, there's all these kinks. There's a thing going on here. And so that is sort of an interesting discussion where you don't even mathematical model. And then if you mathematical model, then basically you have another sophistication, which is exactly what you outline. Now, one of the key questions that I actually have a bunch of questions, but I don't want to occupy, we only have 20 minutes to discuss, but I want to actually ask one substantial question that's exactly related to these two things. So now you sort of outline the inverse process, where you go from the frequency to the mathematical model. And you say there is also a forward process. This is quite interesting. It's a little bit like, it reminded me of a very particular example where there's a Roman bath on one side of the drawing, and on the other side, there is a design for New St. Peter's. And so obviously the art historians would say, this is the front side of the drawing, and the archaeologists would say, this is the front side of the drawing. And so both cannot live without each other. So it's a feedback loop. And so how do you live that feedback loop? That is my question, because I have this thing, I have data, and I want to work with people who do mathematical models, but they sort of come back and they have completely different motivations. So how do we integrate that into some kind of hypercycle of cultural research?
Well, first of all, I have to say, in cultural evolutionary research, I don't think they can live without each other. I think, unfortunately, so far they lived happily, almost in parallel. I think a lot of theoretical research is basically only on a theory level, without ever attempting to apply the theory to data. So, and I think this was needed because you needed some body of theory, but of course, if the theory is just the theory and we don't know how well it actually, how well humans really, optimize according to some criteria, what is assumed in those models, then the two things don't connect. And unfortunately, cultural evolution, at least the narrow niche I am in, it is not yet that, well, I would say we are just starting with trying to use this mathematical theory to actually also try to add some additional explanation to what, let's say, field workers already do to the data with, very sophisticated statistical analysis. But, a lot of the social learning literature, you will find the results of what type of social learning is expected to have evolved under natural selection. So these types are fine. This is mathematically is beautiful. It's nothing wrong with this, and these are interesting results. But they're so bloody complicated to verify, because you cannot go to a person saying like, okay, so have you now used your conformist bias? Have you used your prestige bias? Because even if I ask myself, why did I choose this shirt today? I don't know. It's things you do intuitively, and so testing these questions, or testing this social learning hypothesis is not straightforward, because the data that you would need to do this, almost one-to-one, is often not there, and so you need to do it while the crux of okay, all what I can observe is how the variant, which is the object of basically my selection, basically has changed over time. But then, of course, I have the population level problem that I have so much averaging going on that I can then really re-infer those underlying processes. It's on a different page. So in some sense, what we want to do is to make this circle basically more the norm, that we try to develop statistical tools which make this, which make applying the mathematical theory to data a little bit easier. But in order to do this, you also need to think about before you develop your mathematical model. Like, okay, what does it need to generate, or what do I need to model in order to be able to apply it to the data that I'm actually having, and not to, you know, an idealized data, what I unfortunately will never be able to have. And this is particularly true if you think of archaeological case studies, where, you know, the archaeological evidence and the archaeological record is the only evidence about those past traditions what you ever had. You can't go back in time, but that's all what you have. So I think there's, again, I'm talking about this narrow field of social learning literature where I'm working in. There's a lot to be done to actually make it to norm to go this full circle. I would say we are there very much behind, you know, a lot of applications which are much more data science driven. And but I think there's a lot of stuff which is coming. There's a lot of interesting research coming from evolutionary biology, but also from digital humanities, who are so much better in doing that than we are. I mean, cultural evolution, I don't want to, you know, I mean me, not anyone in the audience. And so I think it's an absolutely exciting time to hopefully getting all the input and then really making this a norm. Because I would also say a lot of research, what we are doing, I would call it the forward problem, because often what we do is like, okay, unbiased transmission, let's add social structure. Does it change anything or not? So, and that's what, for me, it's a classical forward problem. You know, I define my model, I get some data, or the model produces something, and I can compare it to something else. But I mean, we only do this to figure out, okay, do we need to include this in order to make the other loop, to make the inverse loop? And so I think we have to do a lot of more work on that, and kind of really figuring out what are the specifics of a cultural social learning model that we need to include in terms of demographics, in terms of, you know, other complexity, what you potentially need to put in, and then you can do the inferential studies. But I'm a big fan of doing, you know, some theoretical tests first on basically on what's possible and where you should accept the boundary to be, then basically throw it on data without having expectation on how much it can, or where it will stop naturally. So I think that's this goes hand in hand. I completely agree with you, but we have quite a bit of work to do to have the full cycle, you know, naturally occurring.
Anders Karius.
Hello.
I understand.
Yeah, thanks for the interesting talk. So relating to the choosing the shirt question, so there is this whole side of cultural evolution which is like this very experimental, right? So and a lot of their experiments are actually very sort of material. So, you know, they make people construct towers out of spaghetti and whatnot. But so in your view, how well do these things come together? This sort of like, especially if you're interested in the sort of prehistoric pottery or whatever, like sort of like the mathematical models and experiments done on modern humans, like, can these things come together to better understand prehistoric things, or do you think this cooperation is rather more limited, or the possibilities are limited?
Let's say it that way. I think the first of all, the link between experimental literature and the theoretical literature is, I don't think, as fleshed out as it could be. Because, you know, the first step, what should happen is that you take the data from those experiments and actually try to infer with our models, you know, those biases, what they, you know, potentially know peoples were using. And also this hasn't been done yet, because I mean, that's in some sense the best test what we probably could have in a sense of generating data, which is not generated by another mathematical model, but by real humans.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly, where you know, all sorts of complexity in the decision hopefully or probably take into, even so it is very focused on a very narrow task done in the laboratory. But you know, in some sense, that would be the ideal situation of testing this kind of more mathematical approach, and kind of also just, you know, the way we formalize conformity, you know, it's an equation we can write down, does it match, you know, the effect that the conformist bias a human would express has on the frequency distribution of a cultural variant, and hasn't been done yet. So I think the link between the experimental literature and the theoretical literature is even more underexplored than the link between the theoretical literature and the empirical literature. And but I think it could be incredibly fruitful if you know, you have precisely these experiments where you're like, okay, I know from where the people looked at what kind of social cues they used, and then I know what kind of bias they used, and then, you know, whatever. We should precisely do this, kind of design an experiment where we have the frequency at something coming out, and then we have the real human cognitive biases acting on them, and see how well we can, you know, recover them with our mathematical formulation. So that, for me, it's the first step that already hasn't been done yet.
So you feel that it can be extrapolated, like, yeah, from, like, if you test a bunch of like undergraduates in a university on a task, and then if the mathematical model produces, like, sort of matches these things, then you would consider it sort of validated and applicable to also data that may come from like thousands of years ago.
I mean, this is, I mean, that would be the first validation that the mathematical model actually can can infer the right transmission biases. So we have set it up actually in the right way, and we have set up the way we model conformity in the way that it actually acts in reality. So that's, for me, the first step. So, and then there is a question, of course, like, okay, cool, this is what, you know, undergraduates do. First farmer, they have the same cognitive biases or a different decision-making process. Unfortunately, you know, this is, I'm not sure we will ever know this, but at least with this information, we could try and again make it very clear, okay, based on our assumption that, you know, first farmers are not too different from and so on. I mean, but, you know, this, we don't need to go there yet because we haven't done even the first step yet. So there is, you know, a huge amount of work, you know, still in front of us, which hasn't been done yet. But, you know, ideally, this all should be done for, you know, justifying the results.
We have another 6 minutes, so let's everybody do one question so we have some around. Mike, Tom.
Okay, thank you very much. It was most interesting. Concerning what you have been just discussing with Andres, am I right to understand that actually there are examples with different cognitive bias, different learning biases in place? So I mean, it might be one thing for pottery, another thing for, I don't know, metal tools, another thing for something else. So it is quite difficult to infer from the behavior of modern day students, because it quite easily might be different mechanisms, different values of these parameters for different sorts of tools. And concerning, and actually I have one more rather dull question. Can you, maybe I missed something, can you walk us through this picture which is on the screen right now, because there are
I put it up for you.
There are four types of symbols, and I'm a little bit lost.
Yes, no, I put it up for you. I wanted to explain it. This is precisely where I said I will have a figure for explaining the influence of alpha. So this is, you remember, this is our sample which we had, you know,
yes,
variant 1, 2, 5, and so on. So, and this are the population level frequencies of our, you know, of type 1, of type 2, type 3, type 4, and so on. From which I could have, all of these, again, it should have been, it's a marginal plot because that's the only thing I can draw. It should be an 8-dimensional plot, but anyway, so these are the marginal distributions, marginal distributions here, from the relative frequency on the population level of this type that could produce basically this sample. So and you see they are incredibly wide. So for
once again, so that it is sort of the width of the distribution.
Yeah.
So it is the range of possible values of this thing. And number one, how you define the range, because I mean, it is probably continuous and it has some sort of tails. Sorry?
95% confidence interval.
Okay, okay. And what is the difference between the red ones and
So this is this is a frequency range 95%, and the red ones are just two different alpha values. This is alpha of 2 and this is alpha of 1. And what you see is that changing the alpha values change a little bit the importance of rare variance. So we kind of slightly increase the population level frequency of variants which have only been sampled once, or in fact 0 time.
Yes, so basically, as far as I understood, you have this Dirichlet distribution as a prior, and then you sort of do some Bayesian thing in order to fit it to this. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I think I more or less understood. Thank you very much.
Cool. Super. And to your other question, yes, I mean, it is also a question what we need to think carefully about. What is an appropriate social learning mechanism given what I want to transmit? Because so far what we looked at is more or less neutral traits. You know, it's okay, there is a huge debate whether pottery designs are neutral or not. However, they can at least be assumed to be functional neutral. So all of those cups, they all hold water, they all do this equally well. Does not matter what kind of pottery design there's on it. Names, again, they are not neutral. However, they they have the function of identifying a person, and a name precisely does this. So
yeah, probably they have a dimension of prestige also.
Exactly, there's all sorts of things attached to it, but in the general, they are probably more neutral than basically whether I go to the Sahara and know how to find water, or I do. I mean, this is now the extreme case because all of what I would talk to these traits, I would put them more on the, there is definitely a prestige effect on those terms on it, but in terms of they all do their function equally well. They identify a person, that's fine. But if we are now looking at adaptive traits in a sense of how you do something in order to survive, then the thing comes, of course, different. Then then in some sense, you will look what people do and you choose what the best thing is, kind of what's called a pair bias social learning. So you would not look at a novelty bias because it could potentially kill you if you copy the weird thing that some newcomer does. So of course there are a huge array of social learning biases which make more or less sense depending on the feature you're looking at. I mean, if it's adaptive or non-adaptive, it makes a whole difference, because if I look at the paper airplanes, I mean, all what they have to do is they have to fly further. So I mean, again, there is some motivation of, okay, you have to produce something that's better what has been there before. So again, there conformity bias doesn't make sense because, or maybe it does make sense to copy something and then do some tinkering on it, but that gets us more into basically how do we modify something. But I mean, in that sense, in all of those already experiments, there is something in it. We're like, look, no, you're not just copy the same thing because that's against the rule of the game. You should do something which is actually better than what has been before. But you can use social information. So it is, it's almost each application. In order to model it, you have to think very, very careful what's actually the underlying generative model. And that's basically has to almost be tailor-made to the application you're looking at. So coming up with a universal model of social learning will fail because it will be different for different applications. And we are not after a universal model. And I mean, for each application, I think it will be slightly different because you have to take this kind of cultural realism, what it is, and really into account. So yeah, that's
thank you very much. So I think we get 2 or 3 more minutes because we start late. I would like to ask one last question, which is, as a mathematician, how uncomfortable would you be with not boiling down to one model, but to say, okay, there's not only sort of like a diversity in the output, but there is probably something like a space of mechanisms that are selected from at any given time, a little bit like what Stephen Wolfram calls rural space. So there's multiple mechanisms and they're used all the time in different frequencies in a heterogeneous way. That is obviously something that must be very uncomfortable, because all of a sudden you don't have like, I'm working on the model that explains the distribution, but you get a distribution of mechanisms that is interacting with a distribution of stuff. And so what would be a take on that?
I mean, I personally would be, perfectly fine with this, as long if I would know that it could be done. Because what's my worry about this? If kind of, give yourself too much choice in terms of processes you can choose, also heterogeneity in the population, is that, then in some sense, inferential power has to go down, especially when then for me, the next interesting question is, okay, if I want to do this, what is the resolution of the data that I need in order to make this choice, or that can inform this basically choice, that I can allow for a heterogeneous population where everybody is doing something slightly different, and not something what I assume where I'm like, if we infer, let's say, an anti-novelty, that doesn't mean that we assume that everybody is behaving in exactly the same anti-novelty biased way, but it's more the aggregate of the population, has this effect on the population, because we all know how complicated it is to choose a baby name, and definitely it's not just anti-novelty bias. Everybody has its own reason, but for whatever reason, all those reasons seem to aggregate and seem to be able to be described by one process, which is this one, but amongst others, this anti-novelty, or at least slight anti-novelty. So this is something I feel comfortable with saying. That's because I'm not, none of the studies will ever tell you what an individual is doing for choosing the name of their child. All what this can do is tells you, okay, all of those individuals will do something different, but for whatever reason, it aggregates on the population level that these tendencies are coming out. So what you are suggesting is super interesting, but my question then would be, what data do you need? And that's also, the progeny distribution is a very crude knife. If they have this beautiful data, what I want to do is a time series analysis where I have every name, over time. So I can do so much more. And then, the cool question is, can I do what you just suggested with, this data? But again, this needs new models, new inferential new inferential methods. But yeah, I didn't want to go there, but let's see how long it takes.
Thank you very much. I would have had a bunch of more questions, but time is up. And so this was fantastic. As always, I'm gonna sort of give a little preview of next week. So next week we will have Julio M. Moutinho, who is the Dean of Engineering at Northwestern University, and also the co-founder of the Northwestern Institute for Complex Systems, together with Bruce Mau, who is a famous designer, who was the designer of the most popular architecture book of the 1990s, called SML-XL by Rem Koolhaas. And they together will present in a keynote their book called The Nexus, The New Convergence of Art, Technology, and Science, which comes out at MIT Press. It's a very high-profile book that was very costly in terms of like figures going into it. And one of the interesting things there is exactly sort of underscoring why people like us are hanging out together, which is the premise that in the 21st century, people who do science, people who do art, people who are in technology are working together in a sort of common conceptual space. And so I just want to sort of like, invite you to take part in this for 3 reasons. There is an interesting thing. So Moutinho is a chemist / fluid dynamicist. He's also a painter, and he sort of like inaugurated one of the 5 places that is most prominent in complexity science, all based on the same philosophy. And I think that is sort of something which I was the reason I invited him recently to the board of CUDAN, because this represents so much. what we're doing, and he was happy to join for the reason that what we're doing is so much in line with what he's outlining there. And today was another one of these examples. I think it's fundamentally important to make progress in understanding of culture by having exactly these kind of conversations. And so for that, I thank you very much, Kandler, for being our guest today. This was super, super inspiring, and I learned a lot. And I guess everybody else did too. And so I hope we meet very, very soon again. And see you next week, hopefully.
Okay. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.